So we'll turn it over to Mr. Ken Coughlan.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank the NALC Life Ministries team for allowing me to come speak to you today. For those of you that don't know me, as Rebecca just mentioned, my name is Ken Coughlan, and I work here at the moment part-time for Trinity, doing all the video work. That's actually about to change. I'm going to be starting full-time in just about over a week, as I'm going to be taking on some new duties with the school here that we've got. Now, you may be wondering, especially those of you who do know me, may be wondering why I'm up here talking to you, and that's because most of you that know me in this room know me as the video guy. And so what is the video guy doing up here talking to you at a life conference? Well, the one thing you probably don't know about me is, as much as I've been making movies for about a decade and a half now, for about 2 decades, I've also been a Christian apologist. And I've been a lawyer for the past 21 years. Again, next Friday, last day as a lawyer. But anyway, I'm kind of counting down the days. But no, for 21 years, I've been a lawyer, and that kind of got me into Christian apologetics. For those of you that aren't familiar with Christian apologetics, essentially, if I were to give it a quick summary, my motto, my calling, if you want to say, is to live out as best I can 1 Peter 3:15 and 16, which says, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. So in short, I talk to non-believers about Christianity. More than that, I actually do teach Christians, and I teach classes about how to answer many of the questions that people today are asking, including, for today's purposes, questions about abortion. So what I'm hoping to contribute today is hopefully something a little bit different from what you've already heard so far and what you've heard in the past, because I'm the guy that goes out there and has conversations. What I'm hoping to instill in you today is less the what of answering the abortion question and more of the how. There are plenty of resources, all sorts of resources out there to help us learn the what. We hear wonderful messages today, for example, like we just heard earlier today about, fetal pain development, for example. And so the question then becomes, though, once we get all that information and all that knowledge inside of our head, what do we do with it? All right. You see, aside from convincing us, which is a good thing, all that information isn't doing anybody one lick of good as long as it stays in here. All right. And so the question is, we need to get it out to the people in the world. People who aren't, let's face it, they're not going to be coming to conferences like this one. So we have the data, but we need to take that data and get it into the dialogue. And that's what I'm going to try to be helping with. So to be clear, my task today is not so much to make the pro-life case for you, all right, as much as I'm trying to give you some practical tools on how to get these conversations started in the real world and how to engage in them respectfully, but without compromising. So, that being said, let's get started. I think it's honest to say that many people today are frankly terrified about talking about abortion. In a Facebook post introducing this session, Rebecca here asked if you'd ever any of the thoughts like these, ever had any thoughts like these up on the screen. I don't know what to say. I know God's gift of life is precious, but I don't know how to explain that to my neighbor. Or people think that I'm against women when I say that I'm pro-life. A lot of people out there have thoughts like these, and these are the kinds of thoughts that shut mouths. Not the mouth of the pro-choicer, but the mouth of the pro-lifer who knows they should get out there and try to say something. The issue is that people know the importance of the issue, but they're afraid that they won't know what to do when they get into the conversation. And lots of times, they might not even be able to clearly articulate what their fear is exactly. But in my experience, it usually ends up to boiling down to 2 things, all right? The first concern that a lot of people have is they don't even know how to get the conversation started. All right, how can you steer the conversation into the topic of abortion without sounding like it's completely unnatural and completely forced? All right, The second worry that a lot of people have is they worry that they won't know or don't know what the pro-choice person is going to say back to them, and they're worried about not knowing how to respond. Now, you could add a third one to this list if you wanted to. People are afraid of talking to their family members or to their friends because they don't want to rock the boat, so to speak. All right? But hopefully, as we work our way through these other two concerns, what you're going to see is that we're developing a very natural way of talking about the issue of abortion, so it shouldn't matter who you're talking to. All right? So today what I want to do is I want to take a closer look at these two primary concerns that people have and show you why you don't need to lose sleep over either one of them. The first, how do you get the conversation started? Now, I want to begin this topic by giving you an example of what not to do, all right? It comes from a story that's told by Christian apologist Michael Ramsden. He's with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. I imagine some of you have probably heard of him. Now, I'm just going to give you the abbreviated version of the story. If you want to hear the whole thing, you can go to YouTube and search for Conversational Apologetics. That's the name of his lecture where he tells this story. He gives the whole thing. But what happens here is Mr. Ramsden's got a speaking engagement he's got to go to, okay? So naturally, when he's got a speaking engagement, you want to look good, you want to make a good impression. So what's he got to get? He's got to get a haircut, right? And so he goes down just a couple blocks from his house. There's a salon down there to go get a haircut. And he ends up getting his hair cut by the owner of the salon. Now, as she starts cutting his hair, she turns to the person next to her and says, "My business is doing so well, but there must be more to life than this." All right, stop there for just a second. What is she really saying right there? She has expressed this as a statement, right? But is that really a statement? No, she's asking a question, isn't she? The question is there more to life than this? What's happened here is he's gone in for a haircut, and God's given him an opportunity. He's given him an opening to share the gospel. That's lesson number one in getting these conversations started. And we'll touch more on this in a little bit. But we see an example of it right here, and that is listen, watch for opportunities, because God will give them to you if you pay attention. All right? I'm going to give an example here in a little bit that deals specifically with the subject of abortion, but first I want to finish talking about Mr. Ramsden's story. So when he hears her say this, he responds. He takes the opening, and he says, what you say is very true. In life, we're not made happy by what we acquire, but by what we appreciate. Hairdresser stops what she's doing, says, "Could you say that again?" "Well, sure. In life, we're not made happy by what we acquire, but what we appreciate." Down go the scissors, off she goes into the back room, grabs a notebook and a pencil, comes back out to him. "Could you say that one more time?" All right? And he repeats it again. She writes it down. Now, Mr. Ramsden's a pretty smart man. He gets the hint that maybe she's a little bit interested, so he keeps going, right? And so he goes on to say, the trouble we have today is not that we feel we have nothing to be grateful for, but we feel that we have no one to be grateful to. Same thing. Down go the scissors, up comes the notebook. "Could you repeat that again?" All right. They go on like this for about an hour and 15 minutes. All right. And in that time, he gets this opportunity to share the whole gospel with her, to have a great conversation. Now, 2 weeks later, Mr. Ramsden decides he wants to try to follow up with her and see what happens. So he comes back to get the shortest hair he's ever had in his life, only 2 weeks later, obviously. But he comes back again. She sees him. She comes. She sits him down. And when she sits him down, she tells him that after they spoke, she went back home and told her husband everything they talked about. And do you know what he said? He said she was preaching at him. Well, of course she was. Think about it for a second. She goes home, right? They both get home from work. What do you think she does? Out comes the notebook, right? Did you know that in life we're not made happy by what we acquire, by what we appreciate? It's not that you have nothing to be grateful for, but you have no one to be grateful to. So what's the difference between their two conversations? All right? Why was she so open, but her husband was so closed? The difference was that in the first conversation, Michael Ramsden was talking with her, whereas in the second, she was talking at her husband. All too often, we talk at people. we have all this information inside of our heads, right? We just want to get it out there. So we blurt it all out really, really fast. I mean, after all, if we let the other person get a word in edgewise, then we might forget something, or we might not get another opportunity to jump back into the conversation. And it's really, 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 really important that we say every single thing we want to say, right? No, it's not. No, it's not. When you engage in conversations like that, you're being more concerned with yourself than you are with the other person. All right? If you want to talk to yourself, you want to hear yourself speak, go for it. That's what mirrors are for, okay? You can go, you're going to have a great audience. But when you're out in public, the goal is not just to hear yourself speak, all right? It's to be respectful of the other person. So don't do that when you go out there. It's not respectful of the other person, and it's not going to work, all right? I mean, if you think about it, what actually happens in the real world when you walk up to someone and you start talking at them, especially about an issue that's as emotionally charged for a lot of people like abortion? They get defensive, right? It's the moment you launch into attack mode, they launch into their defense mode, and whoop, up go their walls, all right? Your conversation is done before it's even gotten started. The whole time you're talking, I got news for you, they're not listening to you. They're planning out what their counterattack's gonna be. So if that's what we shouldn't do, then the question arises, what should we do? How do we handle these conversations? If we can't just go find some unsuspecting person and start rattling off all these facts, then how do we get the conversation started without them putting their walls up? Here's how. Step one is what I mentioned when we were talking about that Michael Ramsden story and his haircut. Look for opportunities. I got news for you, they're all around us. But just like Michael Ramsden, we need to pay attention. I can give you a very recent example, something that many of you in this room probably have heard about, and yet it deals specifically with abortion. Maybe you've even had a similar conversation like this get started, and I wonder how many Christians out there, frankly, missed the opportunity to turn the conversation towards abortion. Golden Globe Awards. Anybody see anything special about the Golden Globes Awards a couple weeks ago? Ricky Gervais was the host, and in his opening monologue, well, let's just say it was very interesting and it got a lot of attention, okay? For about a week afterwards, it was all over the internet. Everybody was talking about it. Why? Because here we have Ricky Gervais. He's an atheist. He's a comedian. He's a Hollywood insider. And he flat out called out the so-called Hollywood elite for their hypocrisy. He told them, he says, you guys will go out there and you'll make movies for companies like Apple. Apple has sweatshops in China. You don't have a problem with that. But then you win an award, and you're going to get up here and act like you have the moral high ground and preach to us about whatever your political or moral topic of the day is. What Gervais told them, in words that are not suitable for a Christian conference, mind you, okay, he told them, if you win tonight, come up here, get your award, thank your producer, thank your God, get off the stage. For about a week afterwards, people all over the country were talking about this. Now, why do I say that conversation that was permeating the culture gave us an opportunity to turn some of these conversations towards abortion? Well, let me ask you a simple question. You can probably predict the answer to this one. Do you think those Hollywood actors took Mr. Gervais's advice? This is the audience participation part of the program. No, of course they didn't. Give you an example, Michelle Williams. Michelle Williams won the Golden Globe for Best Actress in a Miniseries or Motion Picture Made for Television. When accepting her award, she started out her speech, this is my Golden Globe Award, all right? She says, when you put this in someone's hands, you're acknowledging the choices they make as an actor, moment by moment, scene by scene, day by day. So far, so good, right? Yes, that is exactly what we do. When we give you an award for acting, we're acknowledging the choices you made as an actor. Michelle needed to quit while she was ahead, but she didn't. She kept going. She went on to add, but you're also acknowledging the choices they make as a person. Whoa. Since when does giving someone an acting award mean you're recognizing them for anything other than, oh, I don't know, they're acting, okay? Now, if you listen to where she's going with this, you may start to notice a word that keeps popping up in her speech here. Choice, 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 choice. You think she's going somewhere with this? Yeah, spoiler alert, she was. All right, so she goes on and she talks about all that she's done in her life and how it's been a life of her own making. And then she brought in the punchline. I wouldn't have been able to do this without employing a woman's right to choose. Of course, what do you think happens? Thunderous applause through the whole room. Now, how would that give us an opportunity to gently move a conversation towards abortion? Let me show you a hypothetical conversation. Let's suppose somebody walks up to us and they says, hey, did you hear what Ricky Gervais said in his monologue at the Golden Globes? How do you respond? Yeah, but it obviously didn't do a lot of good, did it? Did you hear what Michelle Williams said in her acceptance speech? Well, sure, I actually kind of liked what she said. Really, what'd you like about it? Ta-da! You're in. You have now naturally moved the conversation onto the topic of abortion with two simple questions. But the key here is you need to listen for the opportunities. They're out there. Now, this hypothetical conversation here also happens to illustrate step 2 in how to get these conversations started, and that is this: ask, don't tell. You're gonna make a lot more headway with people if you use questions as opposed to statements. To illustrate this, I want to take a look at a different way this conversation might have happened, all right? So let's say the person number 1 says, like they always did, hey, did you hear what Ricky Gervais said in his monologue at the Golden Globes? And then you say in response, yeah, but obviously it didn't do a lot of good. I mean, Michelle Williams still launched into a pro-abortion lecture in her acceptance speech. And when she said that she wouldn't have been able to get where she is today without a woman's right to choose, she was essentially just saying that she could only succeed by killing unborn children. All right. Now, is everything I said true? Yeah. I mean, that is, if you get past all of her rhetorical flourish, that's what her statement meant, right? But if you're talking to a person who's pro-choice, what's going to happen if you take that approach? Up go the walls, right? They're ready, their defense has gone up, the counterattack is being planned. Quite often, voices get raised. That's not what we're going for, is it? As we'll see as we work through some more of these things, asking questions is more than just a good way to start a conversation. It's actually a very good way to navigate your way through a conversation even once it's gotten going. So the question is, why do questions work? Why are questions so much better than statements? Well, first of all, questions invite the other person to speak. If they're the one doing the talking, they can't complain that you're preaching at them, can they? You're drawing things out of them, but they're the one doing the speaking. Another advantage to questions is that even though the other person is doing all the talking, you're actually the one in control of the conversation. If you ask the questions and they're answering the questions you ask, who's the one deciding the direction of the conversation? Who's the one deciding what topics are being discussed? It's you. So it's more inviting and you maintain control. Another advantage is that questions inherently foster conversation as opposed to lectures. The essence of a question is that both people participate, right? One person asks the question, the other person gives an answer. Then you ask a question, answer. It's a back and forth, it's a dialogue. So questions allow you to guide the discussion with the other person not feeling like you're lecturing them. There's a great book by Ken Coughlan. This is it. It goes into a lot more detail about how to navigate your way through conversations that I'm going to have time to go through today. It's called Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions. Now, this is actually the old edition. As a matter of fact, just I want to say like 30 days ago, a 10th anniversary edition came out that has even more content in it. But I highly recommend this. If you have a chance to take a look and read it, it's not a long read, and it's great as far as giving a lot of ideas about how to discuss a lot of things, not just abortion. All right? Now, in this book, Ken Coughlan has a primary tactic, the granddaddy of them all. And the slide's already changed behind me, hasn't it? Yeah. He calls it the Columbo tactic. How many people here remember Detective Columbo? Yeah. I love detectives. My wife's not a big Columbo fan. The thing about Columbo is, they openly admit the shows, it's not really much of a whodunit, it's a how catch 'em, right? Because with Columbo, you know who did it from the very beginning, but it seems so impossible. How do you possibly know how they're going to catch him? But anyway, I love it. But if you don't know Detective Columbo, he's this guy. He's a detective, and he goes paid by Peter Falk. And he goes around, he's always wearing this rumpled trench coat, right? He's usually got like a stub of a cigar in his hand, and he's got his notebook, his little notebook that he pulls out to take notes, but he never has a pencil. He's always doing this, and he's got to bum a pencil off of somebody, If you look at him, you'd think he had no idea what he was doing. All right, not a clue. But he did, didn't he? He always had a plan. You know what Columbo's plan was? He would bombard the suspects with question after question after question, all right? It would always something like, just one more thing, or can I ask you just one more question, right? That's my Peter Falk impersonation. It's a lot better since I'm losing my voice a little bit, but not. And what it would do is he would ask them questions, and the suspects would just keep talking and talking and talking until eventually he would catch them in something. That's what Greg Coughlan suggests we need to do. It's a habit we need to get into. Specifically, he proposes 3 ways that we can use questions in conversations about our Christian convictions. The first way we can use questions is to gather information. For example, what do you mean by that? When somebody makes a claim, you ask them, what do you mean by that? Sometimes it's important to get more information about what someone's position is before you go any further, because you don't want to misrepresent it, right? Also, it could be a way of making sure that you're understanding them correctly, or, let's face it, sometimes you can use this to buy yourself some time to think. Another really, really important reason to do something like this is it can get whoever you're speaking to commit to what they think. Because lots of times, you ever had a conversation with someone where it feels like you're shooting at a moving target? All right, so sometimes what you do is when they make a claim, the first thing out of the gate, you want to nail down what exactly they mean so that target can't move later on. All right, now the second use of questions is to reverse the burden of proof. An example that Greg Coughlan gives of this type of question is, how did you come to that conclusion? All right, all too often, we let people get away with just saying something that they saw on Facebook, or maybe they saw some famous celebrity in an acceptance speech say something, okay? And what do we do? Immediately they make a claim, and we feel like we need to jump in to prove them wrong. Hold on a second. They're the ones who made the claim. They're the ones that should be supporting it, right? And I got news for you. 90% of the time, when I get into conversations about these topics, I never have to get past the second question before they're hemming and hawing. You know why? The overwhelming majority of people out there have no idea how they arrived at their conclusions. Not a clue. They read it on social media. Some friend told them something, and they just went right along with it. And so if you actually ask them, gee, how'd you come to that conclusion? They don't know. And now they're grasping for straws. Now, the third way we can use questions is to make a point. All right? If you get to a place in the conversation where number 1 and number 2 aren't getting you there, they're not hemming and hawing, they're actually saying something, then you're still going to be better off phrasing whatever you want to say in the form of a question. All right? It's less confrontational, and it invites the other person to think. This is how you get all that data that's inside your head inserted into the dialogue. If you just start spouting it off, they're shutting down. If you ask a question, you're inviting them to think about it. All right, and the model examples of this are things like, well, have you ever considered X? Or what do you think about Y? Putting it out there like that. Now, I want to show you an example of how this will work in practice, specifically with the subject of abortion. Let's suppose someone says something like this, all right? And you've probably heard this before. All you pro-life people, you only care about babies before they're born. After the baby's born, I don't see you volunteering to take care of it. You have no right to object to abortion unless you're willing to take in all those babies who would be born if abortion was illegal. You heard that one before? All right. What are we learning? Somebody makes that statement. What's the first thing you do? Ask a question, right? Exactly. Hey, somebody's listening. I love that. You ask a question, right? I mean, you could ask what you mean by that type of question. All right, one way you could do this is by, like I said before, trying to restate their position to get them to commit to it. Something like this, like, well, I just want to make sure I'm understanding you right. All right, you're saying that no one has the right to object to unborn children being killed unless they're willing to take care of those unborn children. Is that right? All right. Again, this not only makes sure that you're understanding them correctly, but it gets them to commit to their position so they can't pull a bait and switch later on. All right, so you've gotten them to commit to that. What's next? Now, here's the temptation part, right? Let me ask you a simple question. Is what they said true? Is it true that pro-life people don't do anything to take care of babies after they're born? No, that is the most ridiculously, factually inaccurate statement that's ever been uttered on the face of the earth. I mean, not literally, but you get my point, right? It's not remotely true. And so the temptation at this point is going to be to launch into your diatribe. What's going to happen if you do that? Walls go up, right? Conversation over. And so you've got to think of a way to get this information into the conversation without that happening. I mean, let's face it, you've got organizations out there like Birthright. They're providing baby furniture, their food, childcare. Interestingly, a 2013 study by the Barna Group found that Christians are twice as likely as adults in the general population to adopt, and 50% more likely to actually serve as foster parents. So again, it's factually untrue, but we need to resist that temptation of just spouting it off. So instead, phrase it as one of those third types of questions. You might say something like, well, just out of curiosity, what do you think then about all the services that are being provided by crisis pregnancy centers? Odds are they don't even know there's any services being provided by crisis pregnancy centers. You haven't had to list off all the facts. All you've had to do is ask them a question about it. Now the burden's on them to respond to it. And if they don't have that information, they're not going to be able to respond to it, are they? I mean, they might try denying it and say, oh, well, there aren't any services. Now maybe you can give them a little bit of information on that. But in all likelihood, you're going to get them hemming and hawing again at that point. So that's the third use of Columbo, is to use your questions to make a point. There's another way you can do this too, other than just inserting that data. Sometimes we ask questions to make a point, and the point we're trying to make is we're trying to get people to think through the logical consequences of what they're saying. Because lots of times if you take the standard they're setting up and you extrapolate it out, it's going to lead to results that even they can't live with, all right? Here's a classic example with this one we just talked about. This person saying that, you know what, you have no right to object to abortion if you're not willing to take all those babies in. Okay. So what would you say if someone suggested that we solve our homeless problem by dragging all the homeless people into shelters and poisoning them? Now, would you have the right to object to them doing that even if you didn't have the resources to take them all into your house? What are they going to say at that point in time? What this does is it gets them to think about the consequences of the position that they're taking. In other words, even if not one single pro-life person lifted a finger to help babies after they were born, it still wouldn't mean that we couldn't speak up against killing them, all right? By using questions, though, you keep the other person invested in the conversation, and you make them think through the problems with their view. All right, so step one, look for opportunities. Step two, ask, don't tell. All right, but this means we got to be willing to do a couple things. Number one, we have to be willing to show genuine interest in people. They are people, they're not targets. All right, too often in this discussion, we get so caught up in the argument, the issue, we forget the person. All right, that's partially why I continue to advocate, ask questions, because you're showing respect for that person. All right, second, we need to have, or be willing to have, at least a basic understanding of what's going on in the world around us. If you didn't know about what happened at the Golden Globes, you wouldn't have known it gave you an opportunity to turn the conversation towards abortion. So you do have to be paying attention a little bit to what the world's talking about. All right. Second thing. The second thing that keeps people from engaging in conversations about abortion is they're worried about what people are going to say back to them. How are pro-choicers going to respond? All right? So you've listened for the opportunity, you've asked the right questions, you've gotten onto the topic, but now you're even more terrified than you were to begin with because you're afraid you don't know what they're going to say and you don't know what you're going to say in response. All right? The first thing I want to do is I want to encourage everybody to take the pressure off. All right? In all likelihood, you are not, I hate to break this to you, you might have delusions of grandeur, but in the vast majority of cases, you're not going to bring someone all the way from being a diehard pro-choicer to being a diehard pro-lifer in a single conversation. It's not going to happen. Not to say it never happens, but extremely rarely. It's because this is an emotionally invested issue, and people generally don't let go of issues they have such an emotional investment in so easily. It takes time. And when it does happen, it's usually the result of a conversation they had with you and someone else and someone else and someone else over the course of many months or even many years. All right? And so you may come in and think, well, look at me. I talked to this person and changed their mind. No, you were the reaper. There were a lot of sowers before you, most likely. All right? That's an analogy I stole from Greg Kokel, too. I got to give him credit for that one. And, he took it from the Bible, so there's that. All right, what Greg Kokel does say when he advises is when you get into these conversations, what your goal should be is to put a stone in their shoe, all right? You want them to leave your conversation with something more to think about than they had going into it, something that's kind of nagging at them, like that little pebble that you've got in your shoe they can't stop thinking about, all right? Now, with that being said, and understanding that's the goal, what are people going to say to you? What are pro-choicers going to respond? Actually, pro-choice advocates, believe it or not, make basically the exact same arguments over and over again, all right? And they may put a little bit of a different spin on them, but when you get past the rhetoric, they boil down to some of the same categories. And so if you can learn these few categories, then when you're in a conversation with someone, all you're going to have to do is try to decipher, okay, which categories is falling under, and you're going to know where to go from there. So I want to break down those categories for you, kind of logically. Now, the first approach that people will often take when you do manage to steer the conversation toward the question of abortion is avoidance, all right? First thing they'll try to do is avoid the question altogether. And the way they do that is they'll employ something that's designed to silence you, all right? Their tactic is more to get you to be quiet so that they don't have to listen to what you're saying. I'll give you a common variation of this that every man in this room who has ever stood up for pro-life causes has probably heard this line before, all right? And it goes something like this: unless you're a woman, you don't get a vote. Ever heard that one? Again, just like questions are a valuable way to start a conversation, they're also a valuable way to navigate your way through the conversation once it's started. When someone says something like this to you, your job is to try to get the conversation back on track. All right, they're trying to get you to shut up. You want to get the conversation moving. So what do? You ask a question. Now, this would be one where I'd probably preface it by saying something, you know what, you're right. There are certain things about this issue that I'm never going to understand. I can't because I'm a man. But let me ask you a question. If a woman were to come up to you and say all the exact same things I'm saying to you right now, would you then agree with her? You see, they're not going to say yes, because if they say yes to that question, then they're admitting that the arguments you're raising are good ones and they're wrong, okay? So they can't say, well, sure, if it came out of the mouth of a woman, then I'd completely agree, all right? But at the same time, if they say no, they're admitting that their problem isn't really with your gender. All right? Their objection is to what you're saying, not to who you are. And so that's a very simple question that helps refocus the conversation. All right? So what if they do actually get to the point where they're not avoiding, they're not trying to silence you, they're actually trying to justify their view? Well, the first fallback people typically take is the general appeal to choice, right? This wonderful principle of freedom of choice. They'll say, I believe in a woman's right to choose. Okay. They've made a statement. What do? Ask a question, right, exactly. And the question is, choose what, right? Because, look, a lot of the pro-choice arguments kind of bank on being vague. There is this universal or general amorphous concept of choice. Nobody wants a totalitarian regime to start coming and start telling them what to do, right? And so, yeah, everybody likes free choice. We like to be free. So, hey, who's not pro-choice? Hold up. In some circumstances, none of us are pro-choice because there are certain circumstances that certain things we do not think people should be able to choose. All right? Should a burglar be able to freely choose what house they want to break into tonight? Should a peeping Tom be able to freely choose whatever tree they want to climb and window they want to peer through? I think we should pretty universally agree the answer to that is no. So there are limits to choices. We all seem to intuitively agree that choice is not universal. It's a general principle. So we need to ask them that question, choose what? All right? Or you could ask them some of these other questions I talked about. If they try to say, I believe in everybody should be free to choose whatever they want. Really? Then you can ask them, well, should a burglar be able to freely choose to break into your house tonight? Oh, okay, well, not that choice. All right? So let's take a look at where we are in this conversation right now. Somebody has said to you, I believe in a woman's right to choose. You've asked them, choose what? Which, by the way, notice is just a variation on that first use of Columbo, isn't it? It's what do you mean by that? That's what that question is. And they say, well, to have an abortion. All right, what do you do next? Ask another question. This is the easiest quiz ever, folks, okay? They make a statement, you ask a question, all right? Now, there's a couple ways you could go with this one, and I don't want to make it seem like everything I'm saying, this is the only path you can follow. It's not, all right? But somebody says to have an abortion, you might ask a question like, well, what do you mean by abortion? All right, that's another what do you mean by that type question. And what's that going to do? Well, that's going to open up the conversation to what abortion really is, right? We have this sanitized term that people use to try to hide from what's really going on there. So if you ask them, what do you mean by abortion? Now we can get the conversation geared that way. You could ask them, how did you come to that conclusion? Which would get you into, a discussion about why they believe this particular choice should be permissible versus other ones. So there are different ways you can direct the conversation based upon where you're comfortable, but either way, no matter what you've done, you see what you've done here is you've moved the conversation past this vague idea of just choice. No longer are we talking about we just have a free right to choose. Now we're talking about choose what, and what are right choices and what are improper choices. So that's your goal. Your goal is to use questions to get the conversation directed to the one question that really matters when it comes to abortion. That should be your focus. It's kind of like a compass pointing you towards north, okay, through these conversations. There's one question. Now, what is that one key question that you need to get focused on? It's this one. What is it? What is the unborn? Is it an innocent human being with its own rights or not? If it's not, then no justification for abortion on demand is necessary. You could take it out the same way you would an appendix. But if it is an innocent human being that has its own rights and its own right to life, then no justification for abortion on demand is sufficient. All right? Now, if you can why do I say that that's the question you need to focus on? Because if you can get the conversation directed to that question, there's only two ways they can answer it. It's either yes, it is a valuable human life, or a human with its own rights, or it's not, right? Either way, their answers have to fall under one of those two categories. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to break it down to what are the answers that we see pro-choicers giving under each of those categories. Now, most pro-choice folks do try to argue that the unborn child is not really an innocent human being with its own rights, including the right to life. I think most of them seem to intuitively realize that if you say it's a valuable human, then we shouldn't be killing it, all right? And so what they do is they try to draw some kind of lines of demarcation between the born being valuable and the unborn not being valuable. And in his 1990 book, The Moral Question of Abortion, Stephen Schwartz came up with a really simple acronym to help you remember the 4 ways people try to claim the unborn aren't really valuable. It's called the SLED test. All right? Each letter corresponds to a different type of answer that pro-choice advocates tend to give to make some kind of distinction between the unborn and the born in order to make it morally palatable to them to kill the unborn. S stands for size. The unborn are clearly smaller than a fully grown human being, right? I mean, when the ovum is first fertilized and becomes a zygote, it's about, according to something I read, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about 1/10 of 1 millimeter in diameter. All right, it's tiny. Now, of course, it immediately starts, as you said, it immediately starts growing after that, and changes start happening. But initially, it's really, really small. And so you'll hear this sometimes when people say something like, you're trying to say that something the size of a tip of a pin is entitled to the same rights as a grown woman? Let me ask you this. Does our value as human beings depend upon our size? Is your average NBA player more valuable than the rest of us who aren't so vertically blessed, shall we say? I'm lucky, I'm 6'1". In most rooms, I am one of the taller ones, okay? But not when I stand next to those NBA people. Does our value, or does it change throughout our life as we're growing taller, such that even though now we're fully grown, it'd be wrong to kill us, but if you'd killed us when we were a toddler, we weren't as valuable back then because we were smaller, so that would have been okay. These are questions that you could ask. If someone makes a statement like that that's making distinction based upon size, you ask questions about size to show that in no other circumstance do they consider size to be a determining factor for value. L stands for level of development. The unborn are clearly less developed than born children, aren't they? The classic example of this type of argument is when people like to refer to the unborn as just a clump of cells. I love that one because aren't we all? I mean, we all could be described as clumps of cells, all right, at least physically speaking. The viability argument, that a baby's not valuable until it's viable. That's another example of this level of development type of argument. But here's how you respond. Again, you ask a question. What about this one? Well, the reproductive system of a 5-year-old is not as developed as the reproductive system of a 15-year-old. Does that mean the 15-year-old is more valuable and has more of a right to life than the 5-year-old does? How does our journey of development, which undeniably starts at conception and goes throughout our lives, how does that decide who's a valuable person and who isn't? See, if someone gives you a level of development type of argument, these are the types of questions that can point it out. What you're basically doing is showing them that they don't accept that premise in any other circumstance. They're carving out an exception for this one, basically. They're not being consistent. E is for environment. This gets into those arguments where people try to say the process of being born is what gives someone value. Prior to being born, you don't have a right to life. After you're born, you do. Prior to being born, the child's in the womb. After being born, the child is outside of the womb, right? How does a mere change in environment somehow instill value in someone, instill rights upon someone? If an astronaut goes up into space, does it change our evaluation of them as a human being? Do they cease being a valuable human because they're in a different environment, a radically different environment? What does that have to do with the question of value? Nothing. And finally, D stands for degree of dependency. Pro-choice advocates like to argue that the unborn doesn't have a right to life of its own because it's dependent upon the mother for survival. Newborns and toddlers are also dependent upon their parents for survival, aren't they? They're completely dependent for survival. Does that mean that they don't have the same right to life as someone else does? Or, let's suppose you're at a pond and it's frozen over, and you see some little kid out there running across the pond. No one else is around, just you. That kid falls through the ice, and now they are completely dependent upon you calling 911 for their survival, all right? Did that child go from having a right to life, ironically when their life wasn't in danger, to getting in a position where their life is in danger, but now they're completely dependent, so they don't have a right to life anymore? And then they get rescued, and now they have a right to life again. Does that make any logical sense whatsoever? No, dependency doesn't determine value. All right. The example I gave about newborns and toddlers also being dependent also illustrates a very easy tactic that you can use lots of times to defuse a lot of these arguments that you can make. It's what Scott Klusendorf, he's a gentleman with the Life Training Institute, he calls this trot out the toddler. And the way this works is anytime someone gives you some kind of excuse, whatever excuse they give you, replace the unborn with a toddler and see if the pro-choice advocate can still accept the result. Because if whatever standard they're setting up to use to justify killing the unborn would also justify killing a toddler, most people, with Peter Singer possibly accepted, most people would agree you can't kill the toddler, and so that shows there's a problem with their view. Now, that's the sled test, all right? And it seems to me that for the longest time, most pro-choicers and their responses fell under one of these four categories. However, that's not necessarily true anymore. More and more often now we are seeing that people who will concede that the unborn is an innocent human life and still think it's okay to kill it. And this is scary, but it's true. It's happening. It's been happening for the past 40 years, really, gradually developing. And it's what's called the bodily autonomy argument. An early example of this comes from a thought experiment that was proposed by philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson back in 1971. And back in my undergrad philosophy class, I had to contend with this. My professor asked everybody this, and I'm ashamed to say I did not do as good of a job with it back then as I could probably do with it now. But here's what it says. It says you wake up in the morning and you find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He's been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. If he's unplugged from you now, he will die, but in 9 months, he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Now, regardless of the innocence of the violinist, so the argument goes, you have a right to your own bodily autonomy, right? Nobody can force you to use your body to support someone else, even an innocent person, against your will. So you'd be perfectly within your rights to unhook and walk away. Now, of course, today we live in an era where everything's got to fit on a t-shirt, so we take this argument now, eloquent argument from 40 years ago. Today we say this as, my body, my choice, right? We've seen that one before. There are tons of questions that you could use to illustrate about how this falls apart. I'm going to mention at this point, because we are running a little bit short of time, I do want to mention just a couple of them here, all right? One question you could ask is this: does the unborn child also have a right to bodily autonomy? You see, remember, the bodily autonomy argument concedes that the unborn is an innocent human being. If that's true, then if the mother has a right to bodily autonomy as a result of her being an innocent human being, then the child also should have a right to bodily autonomy, right? And can you think of a more egregious violation of bodily autonomy than, dismembering someone? All right? And so again, their own view actually self-destructs. It defeats their own view. Another question you could ask, and this is one that gets, touchy sometimes, is this bottom one. Does the mother bear any responsibility toward the unborn if she willingly had sex and knew she might get pregnant as a result? See, the violinist example has somebody being kidnapped and a criminal act being committed against them, and they're taken against their will. And somebody certainly, if you ask them this question, may respond with the rape example. And they may say, well, there are certain instances of a pregnancy results from rape. And that's absolutely true, and we need to be sympathetic to that, all right? However, that is the overwhelming minority of cases. A 2005 study in the journal Perspectives on Sexual and Reproductive Health found that only 1% of all abortions were as a result of rape. All right? So if someone raises this, if you ask this question and someone says, well, yeah, but what about the rape questions? You can ask them another question. Okay, fair enough. So am I understanding you correctly that you would agree with me that in the other 99% of cases, abortion should be illegal? See, because if they bring up the rape issue, then is there an issue really with rape? No, because if their issue was really with rape, then they would agree that in the other 99% of cases, we shouldn't be allowing abortion. But they don't, because what they really want is abortion on demand, which means the rape issue is a red herring. All right? And so you need to get past that. How do you get past that? Gently, respectfully, politely, but with another question. All right. In the vast majority of cases, the mother did willingly engage in sex and did know that pregnancy could result from that. And so you ask them this question: does the mother bear any responsibility as a result of the fact that she did this? And if they say no, you follow up with another question. So, if willingly having sex, even when you know pregnancy may result, doesn't create any duty to support the resulting child, then wouldn't that mean that the baby's father also wouldn't have a duty to support the child if the mother decides to carry it to term, as long as he didn't expect pregnancy to result or didn't want pregnancy to result? You see, if just not wanting to have that baby, all right, means that you don't have a duty to support that baby, if engaging in sex, even though you know that it could result in a baby, doesn't give you a duty to support that resulting baby, then why would it support fathers? That's the exact same rationale we use to say fathers need to pay child support, isn't it? It doesn't matter whether you intended to have a baby or not, Dad. You did. You engaged in sex. You knew what was going to possibly happen. Now, as a result, you have a duty to support that child. Same thing with mothers. So what you have is a lot of pro-choice advocates who will take this exact same argument and say one thing when it comes to the mother and one thing when it comes to the father. And why do they do that? Because they want to justify abortion. All right. I want to wrap things up real quick. And what I like to do when I wrap up is I like to give a quick summary, because sometimes what happens is we get so caught up in the minutia, we don't necessarily see how everything fits together and everything that we've done, okay? So what did we talk about today? First thing we talked about is how do we get the conversation started in the first place? First off, we need to be careful to be talking with people, not at them. With that in mind, we talked about a two-step approach to get the ball rolling. Step one is to look for opportunities, because they will come up. And step two is to ask, don't tell. Use questions to direct the conversation. And we learned 3 ways we can use questions, right? Number 1, to gather information. What do you mean by that? Number 2, to reverse the burden of proof. How did you come to that conclusion? And number 3, to make a point. Have you ever considered X, Y, or Z? All right? Next, we turned our attention to what can we expect people to say back to us. And we found that almost every pro-choice argument falls under just a few categories. First, once we get into the conversation, no matter what response we get, we need to keep in mind that the overall goal in directing the conversation is to bring it back to that one question. What is it? What is the unborn? That's your compass point, all right? We talked about how one of the first ways people respond when they're faced with this question is to try to dodge it completely. Rather than answering it, they try to silence you. But through specifically targeted questions, you can refocus the discussion. Next, we learned that if people do try to give some kind of answer rather than just silencing you, first thing they usually resort to is this general appeal to choice as a general principle. But we saw that not all choices are permissible, and you can use questions like choose what in order to illustrate that. Finally, if we do get people to squarely answer the question or focus on the question, what is it? There's only 2 possible answers. Either they think the unborn is a valuable human being, or they don't. If they don't think it's a valuable human being, you use the SLED test. The SLED test tells you how to respond to whatever distinction they try to draw between the born and the unborn, all right? If they do think it's a valuable human being, then they're going to be raising the bodily autonomy argument, and we talked about how that misses the mark. For one thing, if the mother has a right to bodily autonomy, so does the child. The argument actually defeats itself. So hopefully, I've been able to share with you at least the beginnings of a game plan, an outline of it. I know we kind of rushed through it really, really fast. But my goal here is to kind of impress upon everyone that nobody needs to be afraid, all right? It is possible to engage in these conversations about abortion in a manner that is polite, is respectful of the other person, and yet it's uncompromising and you're in complete control. As long as you keep it polite, then it shouldn't matter if you're talking to family, friends, or a complete stranger. Finally, what if somebody does say something to you and you don't know how to respond? Because let's face it, this does take practice, all right? You've got to get out there and you've got to start doing it, all right? What do you do if you don't know the answer to something? It's not that complicated. You politely say, I'm not sure about that. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you. And you end the conversation. Ta-da! You're done. Because remember what we talked about. Your goal here is not to get them all the way to being the pro-life position all in one conversation. If you keep in mind your goal is to put a stone in your shoe, or in their shoe rather, then it takes the pressure off of you, all right? These things usually take time. Don't put so much pressure on yourself, and you're going to find it's a lot easier to get out there and start talking. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to you today. God bless everybody.
Incest say for incest, is there a comparable?
Incest, yeah, I was running short on time. So incest is about 0.5% of all abortions, according to that study. So even if you were to combine rape and incest together, it's 1.5% versus 98.5% are somehow elective.
The other thing I hear talked about now as justification of sorts is viability. In your SLED, is that the D? Is that another? Can you express that viability as?
The viability test is really more of an L. It's really more of a level of development, because what the viability test is saying is that if the fetus, until it gets to a certain level of development, it doesn't have a right to life. In this case, they say that level of development is viability. But of course, the easy question to ask there is, well, wait a minute. Just because obviously viability is something that's determined largely by medical science and the medical resources that are available. So if I have a mother who's in New York City, or let's say Baltimore, we got Johns Hopkins right here. They're in Baltimore, and here in Baltimore, that baby is viable. But then they hop on an airplane and fly to some third world country where they don't have the same medical resources. Now that baby wouldn't be considered viable in that country. Does that baby go from having a right to life to not having a right to life? And they fly back to New York, they have a right to life again. You know, it doesn't hold up. So, but that's really more of a level development argument. So.
All right, thank you. I think we're going to have to cut it off for time for questions. Maybe Ken would be available afterwards if there are any other follow-up questions at that time. We're going to prepare for our Divine Liturgy.